Welcome to our webinar, Enabling the Success of Autistic Colleagues, the conversation with Canadian Tire. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. As an autistic majority company, Auticon celebrates autism and neurodiversity every day. But in honor of World Autism Month, we decided to open up this forum so that others who are interested in learning more about some of our success stories and how they were achieved could celebrate with us. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ali Dusso. I'm the Director of Employment and Recruitment for Auticon Canada, and I'll be your host and moderator today for this session. Before we get started with introductions and our discussion, I just want to take a minute to go through a few housekeeping items. So to minimize distractions from the discussion, we've disabled the meeting chat function, but the Q&A function is available. We have some time set aside towards the end of the session. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, please enter them there and we'll get to as many as possible. If you're joining us from the web browser, the Q&A function may not be working. If you have questions, you can email us at info@auticon.ca and we'll respond to your questions via that email address. This webinar is being recorded and will be conducted in English, but a recording will be made with captioning in English and French, and we can send that out next week. Captioning function is available during the live webinar by clicking the More button and then clicking on Language and Speech and adding caption. Without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful panel. So first from Canadian Tire, we have Monica Callan. Monica is the AVP responsible for IT asset management, IT financial management, and ServiceNow. We also have Edwin Tam with us, who's the manager of the IT asset management team. Next, we have Greyson Mannella, an Auticon consultant who's working with Canadian Tire as a data analyst, together with Monica and Edwin on their team. And last, we have Nikki Gore, Auticon for business development and marketing, who's responsible for the day-to-day relationship with Canadian Tire. So that's everyone. There's also me. I'm Ali Dusso. Hi, nice to meet you. So let's get started. I want to start by talking about what led up to this engagement. How did this successful relationship get started? Greyson, let's start with you. What brought you to Auticon, and how did Auticon help with the job seeking process?
Yeah, so I found out about Auticon through another autistic friend of mine who's really keen on sharing resources. And I was really excited about the opportunity because I tend to find that modern job hunting is not particularly accessible to neurodivergent people. You have to tailor your resumes, you have to write a cover letter for each posting. They might not have all the information you need in the posting. They might ask you to do like a video interview, a group interview, multiple rounds of interviews. There might be a coding test. It can be very difficult for neurodivergent people to get through that kind of process. But Auticon does a great job of providing support with networking, connecting with businesses, offering training, prepping for interviews. They take a lot of the guesswork out of finding a job, which is why I was really excited about it.
It sounds like that was a pretty positive process for you. I'm wondering what it was about the Canadian Tire opportunity in particular that interested you.
Yeah, so when I heard about it, my EC Beth brought it to me, and I was really excited about it because it aligned a lot with my existing skill set, which is data analysis and visualization. It's my primary function. It was what I specialized in university, and it's what I'm most excited about doing in my career. So that was a really exciting prospect. And then once I was actually introduced with the team, I found it to be a very accessible interview process. I have a little bit more about that later that I can talk about. And I also found the team very friendly and personable, which was a really big help.
That's awesome. Let's turn it over to the Canadian Tire team. How did you learn about Auticon?
I'll take that one, Ali. So first of all, good afternoon, everybody, or depending on where you are, good morning. Of learning about Auticon, it actually came to me through my VP. So my VP is Kevin Albert. He's Vice President of Enterprise Infrastructure Services within Canadian Tire. And he learned about it from a presentation that HR did at one of the VP meetings. And he shared that presentation with us. But prior to that, I had a number of conversations with Kevin around a very successful experience that he had a number of years back with employing neurodivergent talent. Like I said, very successful. So when he shared this with me, I immediately thought about some potential opportunities within our IT asset management team. And I talked to him about it, and he agreed. He thought, yeah, this could be an opportunity. So I immediately shared it with Edwin Tam, who is our manager. Edwin, over to you.
So when Monica discussed this opportunity with me, my first thought is I was quite open to engage to explore a little bit further on this. Primarily the reason is because I have some experience working with a neurodiverse talent in the past. And with the right fit, I have seen these folks be able to their talents and have good contribution, successful contribution to the team.
That's great. I'm hearing a lot of talk about fit, and specifically with the asset management team. What was the fit that you saw there?
Good question. So first of all, let me say that the IT asset management practice in general has evolved very quickly over the last couple of years. It's become much more complex. And in addition to that, we have a lot more tools available to us. And those tools have presented us with, honestly, an ocean of data. So we had all of this data now within our IT asset management practice that our analysts were not necessarily equipped with dealing with. And we needed to be able to mine this data. We need to be able to get the reports out of it so that we could start being more proactive. We could be more effective in our management practices. We could give information to our executives so that they can start making solid business decisions as it pertained to our assets. So that's where we saw a potential fit. And based on the skill sets, so what happened was when we engaged Auticon, we were given a number of resumes to look at. And we started going through these resumes and we came to realize here was a skill set that was deeply entrenched in mining data and helping us to understand what the data is telling us. And that's not something that our team can easily do at this point in time. That's where we saw the opportunity. We went, wait a minute, this could really help us. And I got to say that when we started the interviews, and in particular when we were interviewing Greyson, that really became clear. It's okay, this is great. There's some huge experience here and some great talent around mining the data.
It sounds like there was a lot of enthusiasm coming from both yourself and Edwin. How was this received by the broader team? Did everyone share the same excitement and see the same possibility?
I'll be honest with you, not really. So I was excited, Kevin was excited, Edwin was excited, and really that was based on either what we had heard or what we had experienced, and not everybody's got the same experience. So we have people who have, in many cases, personal experiences with neurodiverse behavior. And so they were worried, they were concerned. They're like, oh, I don't know what this means from a support perspective. I don't know if I can properly support this individual. So there was some hesitancy within the team. Now, we worked very closely with the Auticon team. And I got to say that the conversations that we had with the Auticon team were very helpful, pretty well instrumental in terms of turning around that hesitation. And then again, the interview processes also went a long way to helping people to understand where the opportunities would be and really get them past any kind of hesitations that they might have had.
Thanks for sharing that, Monica. I think bias and a lack of knowledge and experience can sometimes interfere with initiatives like this, and it's difficult to talk about, but I think it's also really important to address when we have those difficult questions and we're not certain if we should be asking them. To be able to openly and honestly discuss them can go a really long way. Nikki, would love to hear from you in terms of how things got started with Canadian Tire.
Yeah, sure. So we were introduced to Canadian Tire through some mutual colleagues, which is typically how companies hear about Auticon, is through the grapevine and somebody's worked with us or heard of us. So it happens that way. And one of the things that we really focused on is one of Canadian Tire's values, which is around accessibility, and not just at the physical infrastructure store level, but providing accessible employment as well. And so because of that, in our initial meetings, we found some real natural synergies there. And the key for us in moving the opportunity forward was to find the group or the groups to walk the journey, who were interested in walking the journey with us and piloting a program. And I think we were really fortunate early on to have some passionate advocates. And this was like from the HR perspective. So Kim Knapp, from senior procurement executives like Nancy McClellan, who's since retired, but we appreciate Nancy's sponsorship of us up until her retirement. And even to the level of Rex Lee, the CTO, like we were consistently advised that Rex was keeping an eye on this, really wanted to have an opportunity because he really saw the natural synergies. I will, like Monica put a caution in there, I will put a caution. Canadian Tire is a big company, so it takes time to find the right folks and to find the right sponsorship. And so we did a lot of networking, a lot of education. Kevin was in an information session that I did with HR and a bunch of other leaders to give them a sense of who we are and how we work. And honestly, once we found the groups that, like Monica said, had a business need, a resource or a talent skill gap, and wanted to find an alternative source of recruitment, that's when things really started to move. And of course, because we have talent like Greyson and others who have the skill sets and just needed an opportunity and a different approach to the recruitment process, we were able to start moving and start getting the program up and running.
That's super helpful context. Thank you, Nikki. Spoiler alert, this has been a really successful endeavor and partnership. And I think it would be nice for everyone to hear a little bit about what led to that success for everyone involved. So Greyson, let's start with you. What were the initial elements that supported your inclusion and success within the Canadian Tire team?
Yeah, a big one right off the bat was the fact that Canadian Tire provided the interview questions ahead of time. And the reason that's helpful is because it's nice to have a script for what I'm going to say. I don't know about you, but I write a script in my head when I order at a restaurant. Knowing what to expect and what to say is important to me. So it's great to have a script ready, especially in such a career-defining moment. Another one was that when I was hired, Edwin sent me a very detailed list of steps required for onboarding. So there were tutorials on how to set up all of our apps, and he made this big table chart that had an AM, PM section of everything that we would do in our first week. And I found the visual element of that really helpful to be able to see at a glance where I'm going and knowing what order things will happen in. That really helps me stay on track. In addition, they did things like offer training resources for systems that I was unfamiliar with, like ServiceNow. They have a really big knowledge base, and Edwin was happy to connect me with them. And they also introduced me to different teams and colleagues I would be working with at a gradual pace as I was working with them, as projects with them were coming up. So I wasn't getting too overwhelmed with a lot of information or a lot of different people to keep track of.
That sounds like an incredibly inclusive way of getting things started. And recruitment and onboarding are really important, but so is retention. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about the things that Edwin and the team are doing ongoingly to support your inclusion at Canadian Tire.
Yeah, the biggest one for me is probably having continuous access to a communication channel. Having Edwin and Colleen as well, who I work with, you say, if you ever need help, just reach out to us on Teams, send us a message, and we'll help you whenever we can. That's really good if I ever need to check in on something and see how it's going. As well as we have scheduled recurring meetings. We usually meet about twice a week to share new assignments and progress. And I find that really helpful as a checkpoint. I can schedule my day around that, have things done by that point. Another thing that Edwin does that I find really helpful is that he tends to frame assignments as a clearly defined problem and what he expects for the solution. For example, say we have some data here that needs cleaning up. He'll say, here's the issue with the data. Here's what I want to see done to resolve it. And having that context really helps me decide how to approach it. He uses clear and direct language, and that ensures that there's no ambiguity and I don't get too confused. In terms of more complex problems, usually what Edwin will do is he'll break it down into smaller steps. And oftentimes the first step is help determine what the problem is. Make a Venn diagram or make a flow chart that sort of describes all the moving parts of this problem. And I find that really helpful just to be able to create my own visual element and make sense of it as we're going along.
It sounds like there's some wonderful structure there to help support your success. This is a bit of a big question, Greyson, but I'm wondering from your perspective, what makes a workplace accessible and what accessibility means for neurodivergent folks?
Yeah, it's definitely a big question. The biggest thing is that everyone is different, right? I know a lot of people who like to say that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. That's why they call it autism spectrum disorder, is that it's a spectrum of different strengths and challenges that each autistic person goes through. And the idea of an accessible workplace is often associated with disability, which is obviously very important, and it's highly intersectional with the neurodiversity accessibility as well. But considerations for neurodiversity and for mental disabilities can often get a bit overlooked because they can be so broad. But in my personal opinion, I think accessibility for neurodiversity is a lot just about communicating about work styles, individual needs, and boundaries is really essential to accommodating neurodiversity. For example, maybe someone needs to turn their camera off in meetings to have help reduce masking. Maybe they need like specific quiet hours so they can get their work done without interruptions. It is complex and it varies on a case-by-case basis. But if you're able to have open-minded, continuous dialogues about employee needs, that can really benefit everyone. And that's not just about neurodiverse employees, that's about the whole team.
Absolutely. I love that you're touching on inclusive design and creating opportunities for everyone to feel included in work. I think that's really important messaging. Thank you. Let's talk to the Canadian Tire team a little bit about this. How did you approach the work with Greyson, and how have his unique problem-solving skills and approaches supported your overall success?
We very much listened to the Auticon team when we first started the engagement, right, in terms of, if you will, how we needed to approach the work. And so what we did was we decided to have a very strong, very defined scope of work, like a very strong, focused, defined scope of work. So in our particular case, we had Greyson focus on a subset of our ITS. It's our mobility devices. And as I mentioned before, we had all this data coming in with respect to these devices, but we weren't properly reporting on it. And because of that, we felt that there was opportunity for better management, cost reduction, all that stuff. So when Greyson came in, what we did was we said, listen, here's the scope of work. It's just the mobility devices, right? Here are all the source systems. Coming back to Greyson's comments around Edwin introduced him to various teams and various systems of data, right? Sources of data. We made those introductions, says, here's everything that's feeding our mobility devices, the information around that. This is the kind of information that we're looking to get as well. And here's the target audience, right? So very specific boundaries, if you will, for that work. And I got to say, and we gave Greyson freedom, though, freedom on figure out how you want to report this based on your experience, based on your knowledge. And it was fantastic because he understood the task and he immediately started giving us reporting on data in ways that we couldn't even possibly imagine. We were looking at this going, this is great. And it spawned all kinds of other questions. And then coming back to Greyson's other point was, we had a lot of meetings. We had a very strict schedule around connecting on this work. And those meetings helped us with incremental improvements on the reporting, clarifying where we thought we needed more information or less information, that type of thing. And it was a very good process. It worked very well for us. And we got to a good place with the reporting. And in terms of success, it's been very successful. With that reporting, we've been able to get in front of some of the issues that were plaguing the management of our mobility devices, but we've also been able to save a lot of cost around these assets. So that's been fantastic. I'll hand it over to Edwin to comment as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to comment on the kind of the working relationship and process piece a little bit. I think in my mind is like Auticon in this case provide a lot of guidance, like about, as Greyson mentioned, about the onboarding and the work structure. So that's one of the things that was key in my mind, that making sure that we have established certain structure with Greyson that he can adhere to and feel comfortable in that environment, so that we have, like Greyson said, that we have these regular checkpoints that enable him to get feedback, and then we talk about how we approach a specific problem. So each time is slightly different in terms of, depends on what the topic is, but it's give him the opportunity and the structure that we can have that dialogue and have questions and answers, and then look at what's next from a resolving the problem perspective. And the other side is that we have a monthly checkpoint with the Auticon team as well, just getting that feedback about how things are progressing, anything that I need to watch out for, get that feedback. Or sometimes might have certain things that came up that I also give some more context about, okay, this is the business scenario that has come up, and give more context for the Auticon team as well. So I think that dialogue, like that monthly that checkpoint with Greyson and the dialogue with Auticon is really helpful from the process perspective.
I'm thrilled to hear that. Monica, is there anything that you would add around how partnering with Auticon has supported your ability to create a neuroinclusive workplace?
Create a neurodiverse workplace, you said?
Yeah, like how has the partnership supported your ability to create an inclusive workplace for neurodivergent
inclusive workplace.
folks?
Yeah, I think what's happened is it's really opened up our eyes in terms of what we mean by inclusivity within our group, right? So I think for the most part, a lot of people think about disabilities as physical disabilities. And Greyson, I know that you touched on this earlier as well. This has really opened up our eyes in terms of what inclusivity means. And that really it's about understanding everybody's needs, regardless of what those needs are. And if you can understand them and you can respect them, right, and you can enable individuals to work regardless of what those needs are, it's amazing what value they can bring to your team. In terms of Greyson, he quickly opened up our eyes to what data can tell us, right? Like he showed us data and reporting in ways that we never could possibly have imagined before. And we've shared that data through all the different ranks, and everybody loves the information that's coming out of that. So I have to say that in our particular case, making sure that we were open to Greyson's needs, that we could really support him and how he works, ended up bringing so much value to our team and to the reporting that we need to deliver.
Yeah, a lot of mutual success in that process. That's really nice to hear about. Nikki, I'm curious what it was about Canadian Tire that you think made them a good candidate for collaborating with Auticon.
I'd say the last 5-ish minutes of discussion is probably a good advertisement for why Canadian Tire was a good fit for Auticon. Now, that being said, when we first started talking about it, we didn't know this. So I think through the process, again, this commitment to accessibility as a general concept and this open-mindedness. So there was, as Monica said, some trepidation, but a willing to work through it in order to really, truly demonstrate and work and change, and create more inclusive environments. So I think they recognized the talent pool. Like when they saw the profiles, in particular Greyson, there was a recognition of, oh, wow, you guys, you really have talent here that's going to bring value to our business. But also just this readiness to listen, to learn, an openness to adapt, especially when it came to their recruitment processes and learning to be more inclusive. And I think that's really what organizations need to think about, generally speaking. I talk to a lot of HR leaders and hiring leaders and some talent acquisition folks, and they get really excited about the prospect of working with us and us helping them to attract and retain more diverse talent. But they can be so locked into their process because they've been doing them for so long, or it's baked into, like, they use some recruitment methodology that can be a little bit mercenary, for lack of a better word, or there's some biases or preconceived notions about how they should be evaluating job seekers for positions, and they just can't get their head wrapped around making like a small change, something as small as presenting interview questions prior to the meeting or sharing the interview process. Those accommodations are important in order to be inclusive to neurodivergent job seekers. And so if folks aren't ready to do that, they're not going to be a great candidate for working with Auticon and really being able to attract and retain a wider population of neurodivergent job seekers, I would say.
Yeah, that sounds like really important wisdom to be imparting. Are there some pitfalls for the folks on the line that they could potentially avoid in order to help support their neuro-inclusion efforts?
Yeah, I'd say one of the things that companies who want to embark on a neuro-inclusion effort is there needs to be buy-in by folks who actually have decision-making power. Like, it's one thing to have a hiring manager who's interested in us, but they may end up having to sell it to an HR manager or to a talent acquisition team. So there just needs to be this sort of ability and overall commitment to be open-minded and open to change and to engaging in something a little bit different, an alternative talent acquisition model, for lack of a better word. And I think secondly, there's a real danger in painting the neurodivergent community with one big, broad brush. And I think organizations need to recognize that there's diversity within neurodiversity and be able to be flexible enough to support all of their workers. And then lastly, I would say, don't be afraid of the word accommodation. Many managers, employers, supervisors, even colleagues hear that word and it creates anxiety. It's like, is this going to be expensive? Is this going to be a lot of work for me? And none of that is true, especially when you're accommodating neurodivergent workers, physical infrastructure aside. The accommodations typically cost nothing, and in either like hard cost or really in time. And so whether it's, as Greyson was talking about, an hour's adjustment, or being able to be off camera, or if you're on site having a quiet place to work, meeting structures, communications preferences, none of those cost a penny, and they don't cost a ton of time investment other than thinking about and making it happen. And so the benefit for everybody is huge. And so I think that's what I would also caution. I would also encourage companies to rethink how they perceive an accommodation.
That's really helpful. Yes, small accommodations, big impact, I think, is the overriding message here. So let's move on to talking about some of the key learnings and some advice you have for all of the folks that are here today. Greyson, from your perspective, what does diversity of thought, diversity of experience bring to the broader team?
So I think the biggest thing is that it helps often for new ways of approaching a problem or new problem-solving methods. Maybe there is a tool that someone wants to use that you haven't thought about trying before, or maybe they've taken an existing tool and gone into all of the menus and figured out something to do with it that no one has ever really thought about using before. It's a way of introducing a new perspective outside of what's the existing standard and what people are used to. As well as, I think education in different areas can be applied sometimes in unexpected places. For example, I was really into art when I was growing up, and I found that's actually been very helpful in creating a visual dashboard of data visualizations and making it look presentable, making it look readable. That's something that some people might not think would contribute to that sort of work, but it's really helpful.
Yeah, diverse experience can certainly bring a lot of breadth into a team. Monica touched on earlier, and I think it's important to talk about bias a little bit. It sounds like bias can play a pretty significant role in the exclusion of neurodivergent talent from workplaces at times. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit.
Yeah, as Nikki mentioned earlier, I think open-mindedness is really the key factor. If someone struggles in social situations, they tend to be at a disadvantage in the average hiring scenario. And that might mean that their valuable skills get overlooked due to even just subconscious bias. But I think working with neurodiverse talent really helps reduce stigma. It dispels preconceived notions and myths. And it also increases opportunities for neurodiverse employees who might struggle with the more traditional channels of job hunting. So I think just open-mindedness is the most important thing, and reserving judgments until you can see what people are really capable of.
Very solid advice, Greyson. Thank you. Is there some final piece of advice that you would give to teams who are looking to engage with neurodivergent talent?
It's another big question. There's no roadmap or one-size-fits-all solution for creating an accessible workplace, right? But I think the biggest piece of it is communication. So things like inquiring about employee needs on an individual basis without judgment, that's huge. So asking questions about preferred work style, methods of communication, scheduling boundaries to avoid. For example, maybe someone prefers to do video calls instead of phone calls, or maybe they want to text chat most of the time. Maybe they want to turn their camera off, as I mentioned, in Teams meetings and things like that. And then reflecting on those conversations and thinking about if it's possible to accommodate those needs. If, like Nikki mentioned, it's not going to really cost much in terms of time or money, it's easy enough to just do those things. But understand sometimes that's not always possible. So if it's not, you can work together to find a compromise. And for example, if someone prefers to do remote work and only wants to come into the office a couple days a week, maybe you're willing to let them work remotely whenever they want. But if you need to compromise, maybe they can come into the office 2 or 3 days a week. Or if it's something that's just entrenched in the culture of the workspace, it's also possible to change the standard. For example, maybe not everyone has to come into the office every day, and it can open a channel for people to do remote work where they want. It's all about just reflecting on what people need and figuring out how you can accommodate it. That's able to create an accessible environment, both for neurodivergent employees and also just for all employees. It's helpful for a lot of neurotypical people to not have to go into work every day too.
Yeah, that's really important advice. Thank you, Greyson. Over the Canadian Tire team, if you had one piece of advice for teams looking to engage with neurodivergent talent, what would that be?
I'll start off here, Edwin, if you don't mind. I actually have sort of two pieces of advice. So one is, and I do echo both Nikki and Greyson in this, is you have to keep an open mind, right? In our particular case, we had challenges with digesting our data, understanding our data, and allowing our data to really help us. And when we heard about Auticon, and when we started to talk to Greyson, we saw that potential. We said, I think this is really going to work. And in fact, it did. So I'm very, very grateful for that. But also, I think having an open mind about this was forefront in terms of enabling this. The second thing, too, is I'd say listen to Auticon. So we had a lot of support from the Auticon team on this, and again, very grateful for that. A lot of little tips and tricks to say, hey, in terms of working with neurodiverse talent, these are things to consider. These are things to do. These are things not to do, right? And I think we honestly don't think about that because we just behave in our normal way, like that in how we normally do with our team, and we don't think that some of the things that we do could be triggers, could in fact impact the relationship negatively in some way. So it was very helpful getting those tips and tricks from Auticon. So listen to Auticon is one of my other pieces of advice. Edwin, over to you.
Yeah. So for me, I'm thinking about, obviously, we talk about open-mindedness. And also that is like what I think about is creating an environment that to allow us to share or ask questions. I think each of us have these personal experiences, and we always have question marks about how it's actually going to look like in a work environment, right? So I think it's important that we all acknowledge that people will have questions and have the environment that they're free to talk about it or ask questions, monitoring how things are progressing and make adjustments as we see needed. But it's important to have this kind of environment that we can have an open dialogue on it.
I couldn't agree more with both of you, Edwin. I think touching on the idea that everyone has questions and insecurities at work and areas where they may not be perfect, and creating an environment where we can openly dialogue about that and be comfortable bringing that forward and collaboratively coming up with solutions is certainly a place that's going to be inclusive, I think, for everybody. Nikki, in terms of advice, I'm wondering what you would say are some of the benefits that diversity of thought and experience, what they've brought to broader teams in your years at Auticon that you've seen.
We could probably, and maybe we should do a whole webinar just on this topic because it's such a big thing. But I think if we look, generally speaking, the research is abundant in terms of the business benefit of diversity of thought and experience, improved productivity, innovation, profitability, recruitment, retention. All of those things benefit from diversity. But we also know that from research that teams who don't include diversity of thought and experience are operating at a disadvantage because they're homogeneous. Everybody thinks the same, everybody probably looks the same or maybe looks the same. So you never get that sort of innovation and what have you. And so that actually puts teams and businesses at a disadvantage, honestly. And I think the small things really make a difference here. We have countless examples of ways in which our folks particularly have helped solve difficult problems by taking completely different approaches to solutions. Monica and Edwin have been very clear and very specific about the ways that Greyson has contributed to their business and been really creative in his problem solving and helping to improve the performance of not just the team, but found solutions to big business problems. And I think by the team making those small, really in the grand scheme of things, small adjustments, you can create that broader impact, right? Meeting agendas, note taking, breaks between meetings, not having to be in the office 100% of the time, all the time. What is the result? Improved communication, improved collaboration. It bleeds across other teams. So, these teams are in effect almost creating their own playbook of best practices for the greater good of the company.
So I have a very big question for you now too, which is if you had one piece of advice for the folks on the call, what would that be?
Yeah, thanks for the really big question. Greyson gets big questions, so I get big questions now.
I'm trying to spread it around.
Yeah, so it's hard to boil it down to one thing without oversimplifying, but I think the theme that we've heard throughout is just this commitment to being open-minded, especially when it comes to well-entrenched processes. I would say if the process is more important than the person, then you're not ready to engage neurodivergent talent. And you should probably be revisiting your entire commitment to diversity and inclusion, generally speaking. But the open-minded also applies to stereotypes and biases. I am the parent of an autistic child. Before I started working at Auticon, my views and experiences as they related to autism was only through that lens. And that created unconscious bias on my part. So I would also caution people about looking at autistic or other neurodivergent folks in the construct of the myths, right? And the biggest one is the superpowers, like autistic people have superpowers. And I think this puts really unrealistic expectations on autistic folks, and it can stigmatize them in a completely different and often unwelcome or dangerous way. So diversity needs to be thought of as the value of different and bringing unique skills and perspectives to the conversation. Neurodiversity is one aspect of this. If I can summarize that little diatribe, it would be openness to learning, getting comfortable with a little discomfort, recognizing there's lots to learn, being aware that you are going to make mistakes, and it's okay if you're committed to the learning and really committed to building those inclusive environments.
That's really sage advice, Nikki, and all of the panel. I just want to thank you so much for your honest, thoughtful, thought-provoking responses. I think we've learned a lot today about how Auticon and Canadian Tire were able to collaborate to create a more inclusive workplace and how that environment that's enhanced ultimately by a more diverse talent pool. So it's a win-win for everybody. I'd like to turn it over to our audience so that we can address some of the questions that you might have. I see there's quite a few in the Q&A section. I'm seeing a lot of questions around disclosure and what to do in the absence of disclosure. How do you create an environment that's going to be inclusive of everyone, especially when folks have not disclosed? So Nikki, I'd like to start with you and a question around the research that Auticon conducted this year across Canada and how that relates to disclosure.
Sure, yeah. So this question comes up a lot, like how can we be, in other panels that I said, how can we be inclusive if we don't know? Which is the wrong question to ask, frankly, because regardless of whether or not you have neurodivergent folks in your workplace, the question I ask is, why don't you know? What is going on in your business that is not creating a safe environment for people to feel comfortable with disclosing? So last year we did a survey of a few hundred, I think it was over 500 autistic job seekers across Canada. 45% feel they have to mask their autistic traits. 47% don't feel comfortable disclosing they're autistic. Over half feel they're treated differently once people learn they're autistic. And over 40% have been the target of discrimination at work. So if you're wondering why you don't know, these are the realities that autistic workers are facing in the workplace. So going in with the assumption that you've got autistic and otherwise neurodivergent employees in your company, that's the starting point, so that then you can naturally start creating those inclusive processes. We also know that about over 20% of the workforce is neurodivergent. So Canadian Tire is a big company. They can do the math in terms of what the average of number of employees would be neurodivergent. So I think it's flipping the question around a little bit when you're considering creating inclusive policies and processes and procedures in your company.
Yeah, Grayson, I would love to hear from you a little bit on this topic. You spoke earlier about inclusive design and creating inclusive environments where everyone can flourish. Can you speak to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think disclosure is a very useful tool if you feel comfortable disclosing and you feel like it's going to be beneficial in your communications with your employer. But I also don't think it's necessary. And I think the reason is, say, for example, you own a store and you want it to be wheelchair accessible. You can't build the wheelchair ramp the first time someone in a wheelchair wants to visit. You really have to have that infrastructure in place, regardless of whether or not someone is disclosing. And I think just being able to approach every employee interaction in a more accessible way with a more open-minded dialogue is really the biggest step towards that.
Yeah, that's really helpful feedback. Over to Monica or Edwin. Throughout the process of learning some of the tools to create a more accessible workplace for neurodivergent, are there skills or strategies that you've learned that you'll be applying more broadly to your team?
I think it's a good question. I think that really it was when up front we gave that very solid structure, if you will, right? Around here's the asset pool that we're interested in. Here's the sources of your data. This is what we're looking to get out of the reporting. Here is your audience. Like it was very specific. And I'll be honest with you, we could do that a little more in our workplace. We tend to broad brush things quite a bit sometimes, and you can get lost in that, to be quite honest. I think that actually was quite interesting, going through that process and then quickly being able to get to something that was so helpful. Wow, we could really apply that practice. That's not just to neurodivergent talent. That's something that we could apply across the board, and it probably would help us in many ways. So that was something that I picked up on. Edwin, I don't know if you've got an observation as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the onboarding piece. In this case, I do recall that I really spent some time just going through the initial schedule with Greyson, what are we going to accomplish in week 1, week 2, etc. I think those are like things that we can apply more and more across the board.
Yeah, I wonder if that would expedite onboarding for everyone. I think a lot of folks, when they're starting a new position or even ongoingly, have that insecurity of not knowing if they're doing the right thing or if they're moving at the right pace. And that level of clarity probably removes some of the effort that's going into worrying and puts that effort onto the work at hand, which is ultimately going to benefit everyone. Looking at the questions, there's a couple of questions relating to masking, which is something that Grayson mentioned earlier. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What does it mean to be masking, and what's the impact ultimately?
Yeah, so masking in general, I define it personally as performing normalcy or behaving in a socially acceptable way, or otherwise masking or hiding your autistic traits. And that's a different experience for everyone. But for me personally, I mask pretty much 24/7. Anytime someone can see me, I am masking in some way, shape, or form. And that can often be a very high effort, like draining activity, just to keep yourself still and perform in a very specific way to try and prevent yourself from coming across as strange or abnormal in some way. And I think the best way to prevent people feeling uncomfortable and feeling the compulsion to mask is creating an environment that's comfortable where people can be themselves. And that really helps people become more efficient. And that's not just an autism thing. We all perform to some degree. It just has more of an impact on an autistic person. And being a little bit more forgiving in terms of maybe someone wants to show up in a call in sweatpants and a hoodie today. Just being a little bit more lenient with that can sometimes make a huge difference for autistic people.
Yeah, focusing on the work at hand is the most important thing for sure, and enabling autistic folks to be able to do that as well by removing some of those artificial constraints. I'm hearing that's going to have a big impact. We have a question from one of our participants that's over to the Canadian Tire team in terms of how you manage the initial pushback to the engagement with the rest of the team and what advice you would give to other teams that are managing those sorts of responses.
That's interesting. That comes back to, I think, one of the original questions we had or topics that we had, right? Which was, how did everybody receive this? And not everybody received it the same way. And we did get some push, like we definitely had some individuals, I wouldn't say pushed back, but they weren't comfortable, Right. It was clear that they weren't comfortable with the whole concept at first. We had conversations with them. We included them as well in reviewing all of the resumes to understand the capabilities that the candidates could bring to the team. Because I think there wasn't a general understanding about some of the gaps that we were looking to address, if you will, from a skills perspective within the team. And then we also, like I said, we used the help of Auticon as well to help address people's fears, right? And I think you guys, Auticon, you had some great tips, like I said, tips and tricks and just general advice. And then the interviews went a long way too. So the interviews were huge in terms of getting to understand the candidate and also getting to understand what they could bring to the team. And then once Greyson joined, we made sure that he was in regular meetings, and those regular meetings went a long way to helping anyone who had any kind of hesitancy here, to helping them to understand that this could really work and the value that Greyson could bring to the team. And I think once they saw the value, any kind of fears disappeared completely. Yeah.
That's awesome. There's so many great questions in the chat. I'm going to try and sneak one more in, and we will respond to the other questions by email. This one is also for the Canadian Tire team. Without talking about the positive business aspect of working with Greyson, what impact has Greyson had and Auticon had on your organizational culture?
Organizational culture, I would say, and actually it's very related to the first question that we had as well. I think our team has it expanded our thoughts around inclusivity, right? And we talked about this earlier. It's not just a physical disability. And honestly, so Greyson is just one example, but then I'm sure we have other members in the team who everybody's got their own challenges, right? And nuances and their own needs. And if we understand that, we keep an open mind about that, we understand that, and we can enable them to work in a way that they need to work, they can bring so much value. And I think people are starting to see that, like from an inclusivity perspective, they're starting to see that. They go, wow, it's not just about everybody doing the same thing. Everybody does something a little different, but it brings value as a whole, right? It really adds to the entire team and what we can do. I hope that addressed the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Monica. And thanks everyone on the panel and all of our participants for joining us today. We hope you'll take some lessons from our panel and that maybe you've learned some strategies for enhancing your inclusion across your teams and your businesses. I also hope that you'll join me and my colleagues in celebrating autism and neuroinclusion and neurodiversity and the power of diversity of thought, not just in April, but every day. So thank you so much. Have a great day. And thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.